I'm President and Chief Technical Officer of a company called Failure Analysis. It's a small company over in Capitola. Back in 2012, I got connected up with the Canadian Space Agency at a conference in Big Sky, Montana. And the Canadian Space Agency is very interested in medicine in space. And so they asked me, knowing the area that my company works in, which is called predictive science, much like forensic science was created about 20 years ago to help in solving crimes. Predictive science allows people to be able to predict things accurately. And so what I'll be talking about is some of the applications of predictive science. But because the Canadian Space Agency knew that we specialized in predictive science and we worked in the space industry, they requested that we apply our predictive science to space medicine. And so this presentation is really going to be a summary of the results of our work that we did for the Canadian Space Agency over the last year and a half. The title of this seminar is Using the Astronaut's Fight-or-Flight Response as the Model for Acquiring Mental Illness and the data from either their circadian or their ultradian rhythms. These are rhythms within the body that make sure that our timing is properly, when we eat, when we go to the bathroom, when we sleep, those kinds of things. And we're going to use that, we're proposing to use information about those rhythms to be able to predict what astronaut is going to be acquiring mental illness once they're in space. And once we're able to identify which ones are at risk, we can then change their environment so that we can stop it from occurring. And if an astronaut in deep space does acquire mental illness, there's some suggestions on how we can get them to be fully functional. We can't cure, we can stop the progression, we can stop the mental illness, make them fully functional. We just can't reverse the brain damage that occurs as a result of some of the more severe mental illnesses. So I just mentioned my company. Now here's some of the space projects that we've worked on in the past. Everybody heard of GPS, the Global Positioning System that everybody used to navigate and drive? I designed and developed that for the Air Force 30 years ago and tested them, launched them, redesigned them, fixed them, made sure that they functioned, and then handed it over to the got the DOD to fund it. It had to beat out 2 existing satellite-based navigation systems. Its performance was so good that it beat out 2 and won funding, and then the other 2 went away, and we are now left with GPS. And this is the GPS constellation in space. Each one of those satellites are up in space at over 12,000 miles away. And so it's a constellation. Right now there's about 60 GPS satellites that are up in space that allows people to use the GPS navigation system in their car. And so this is the International Space Station that I worked on many years ago. It's up in space at about 250 miles, orbiting with astronauts on board. And we call 250 miles in space low Earth orbit. We call 12,000 miles away medium Earth orbit. And then the geosynchronous satellites that are used for communications, they're at 22,000 miles away. And the moon is about 395 million miles away. So we're still quite a ways from there. This is the NASA space shuttle that I worked on, helped design back in the 70s. This is a NASA GOES weather satellite that I was responsible for NASA. This one is takes the picture that you see on the evening news whenever they show a picture of the Earth with the weather. This is where they get the data from, the satellites that I designed and launched for NASA back in the 1990s. This is an old Atlas Titan launch vehicle that owned and operated by the Air Force, but they shut it down because it was too unreliable and too expensive. I've also done a bunch of stuff in commercial communication satellites here, and this is the Atlas launch vehicle that I worked on back in the 80s, and then some other communication satellites. So we have my company has an extensive background working in space as well as other industries.
They just launched a satellite a month or so back?
Yeah, GPS. They're launching satellites almost every day, believe it or not.
With an arm? It has an arm?
Well, the space shuttle had an arm at one time built by the Canadian Space Agency. They've shut down that program. The president shut down that program because they killed 14 astronauts, 7 at a time. And so Congress lost faith in NASA, ability to have a safe manned program. And so I mentioned what initiated our work with the Canadian Space Agency, and as I mentioned, the results of our work was published in a paper titled "Using the Brain's Fight-or-Flight Response for Predicting Mental Illness on the Human Spaceflight Program." And in the writing of that paper, I was directed by the Canadian Space Agency what I could include and what I couldn't, because there was some items that they didn't want me to discuss, but I'll be discussing them today. And so what my company works on is called prognostics and health management. And what is that technology, what it does is it allows you to predict things very accurately. And we all know it very well because it's the same process that's used in the medical by the doctors. When you go see a doctor, what do? They take some diagnostic data, they run tests, right? And then they analyze that data, and then what are they able to do? Not only are they able to diagnose your condition, they're able to predict how the turnout is likely going to be. That's called prognosis. And so if you have a terminal illness, they can predict your remaining usable life. Right? They'll give you 6 months to live or 9 months to live. That's called PHM, Prognostic Health Management, and is now being adopted across many industries in order to improve the reliability and safety of a lot of products. But it is the medical industry has been using it for the last 2,000 years. It's only recently that many of the industries, in order to improve the reliability of their products, have been forced to adopt it so that they customers, consumers, when they buy their products, when you bring them home, they won't fail. They won't break as soon as you get them home. Has anybody ever bought something electronics, brought it home, plugged it in, and yeah, we all have had that happen. And it has happened as a result of something that occurred about 50 years ago, and we are only now starting the process to change the industry and to adopt this, what's called prognostics and health management. Over here is some of the applications. As I mentioned, the medical industry uses PHM, to diagnose and prognose patients, but also in investing. I don't know if anybody pays attention to the news where the stock market has been locked up. They've been locked up because the investors are now using PHM to be able to know what to buy, what stocks, what investments to buy, and what to sell by using PHM. The companies that will admit to using it have admitted they're making over 40 million transactions a second. If they make a penny off of each transaction, which they do, that's like $400,000 they make. So it allows them to buy and sell using computer software, and it eliminates the need for the stockbroker, your investor. And so it's called robotic investing. And so that's using PHM. Another one is law enforcement. Santa Cruz, LA, City of LA, and the City of Salinas have all adopted predictive policing. And that allows them to guess at where the next crime is going to be and when. And so that's a software package that's now for sale on the West Coast. A company called IBM is licensing this similar software for the East Coast, but that's called predictive policing, and allows the police to operate with a much lower number of personnel and lower budget, save money. In aerospace, we're using it on the new aircraft, the new Boeing aircraft that's been in the news lately that had a bad battery. That whole aircraft was designed to be able for the equipment to self-prognose themselves. And by the time, before the aircraft has landed on the ground, the equipment has already told the ground crew what equipment to replace or repair, what servicing is necessary. The pilot doesn't get involved at all. It's all automated. There's no people in the loop. It's equipment talking to equipment. It's all automated, and this is what PHM allows to happen. So another application is in geology. We've submitted proposals to the U.S. government to be able to launch a satellite-based underground mapping system so that we can identify locations of in hostile nations that might be harboring weapons of mass destruction. At the same time, we can also predict likely places. We can spot when lava moves underground. When lava moves underground, straight above it is where an earthquake's going to occur, because the lava only moves due to huge forces. And when the lava moves, either it slows down the spin rate of the Earth or it speeds up the spin rate of the Earth, but it causes earthquakes. And so we're able to apply that and be able to predict earthquakes, identify and track tsunamis, volcano eruptions as well. So you can see there's a large variety of applications. In Homeland Security, we've asked Homeland Security to be able to use PHM in order to predict who people at the airport are likely to be a terrorist, so that they can stop and talk to them legally without violating their civil rights. Right now they call that profiling. When you use PHM, the information that we now refer to as profiling becomes prognostic evidence, and it's no longer profiling. So it would allow people to be stopped who have the same traits as a terrorist to be stopped and questioned. Not arrested, but at least to be stopped and questioned to see if they have any identification, or if they fit with the scientific evidence. What other people who have committed terrorism, if they share common traits with those, they'll be allowed to be stopped and talked to legally, rather than be considered profiling.
Watch out what you look like.
Pardon?
Watch out what you look like.
Well, if you look like a terrorist, if you've got 95% of those traits, right now the security can't stop and talk to you. They just want to talk. And right now they can't talk. But by making those traits scientific evidence, then it allows them to at least stop and talk to them without breaking the law. Right now they can't even talk to them.
Well, how accurate can that be? Because the terrorists can change their tactics.
Sure, right. But with the evidence that we have based on all the other terrorist attacks, we use that, and then if they change their tactics, then we take the evidence from the new ones and we add it to our database, and we just keep growing as the terrorists change, we change with it. Why did we choose to apply PHM to mental illness? We knew that the body experiences premature aging. Anybody can't see this, but these are supposed to be the pictures of the presidents, right, before and after. And so we knew that the body experiences premature aging as a consequence of stress. PHM identifies premature aging. And so we knew that there was a connection with mental health, and why we could apply PHM to it, because again, we've seen the evidence of premature aging in the presidents alone. For those that have autoimmune diseases, there are drugs that are available to suppress your autoimmune system. So like if you have had childhood arthritis or adult arthritis, you can take drugs so that you get your immune system suppressed, so it stops attacking itself, the body stops attacking itself. We believe that the immune system is attacking itself because the fight or flight response is controlling the immune system. So one of the things that came out of this research was a recommendation to develop drugs to suppress our fight or flight response, which will then automatically suppress our autoimmune system to stop any autoimmune system diseases as well. And so later on, towards the end, I'll be able to explain that we believe that the fight or flight response is responsible for about 99% of all diseases and illnesses as a consequence of it being used so much in today's lifestyle. And so the process that we used, how we got from the medical industry, the PHM, over into the mental health community, this is the process that was used. Now, in the medical community, they don't worry about areas of the body aging prematurely before the rest. Because the body's self-healing, they don't worry about that when they're diagnosing or prognosing your condition. However, when we applied PHM into the aerospace industry, this is a piece of electronic equipment, what we discovered was, using that process, was that equipment that was failing prematurely. It was failing because some of the electronic parts were aging prematurely. And so that's what allowed us to be successful applying it to other industries, is it being able to identify premature aging. Although the medical community doesn't worry about that aspect of it, all the other applications that we use it for, it does matter, and so it's very important. All future commercial aircraft will be designed using PHM so that the equipment will become intelligent, decision-making, self-prognostic equipment. And so they'll be able to decide, if the pilot decides he wants to do something dangerous, the equipment will let him know, no, you can't do that. It's going to be, they are intelligent decision-making equipment, and that makes the aircraft safer. It's been adopted by the commercial aircraft industry, and it's being adopted also by the military as well. The latest jet fighter that was just approved by the military, the only one approved during peacetime, by the way. The reason that they approved it is because it uses completely designed around PHM, and all the equipment is intelligent decision-making. And as a consequence of that, the logistics of this fighter program over 30 years has been reduced by the cost by 50%. So not only does PHM make things safer and more reliable, longer lasting, not fail prematurely, it cuts the cost over the life of the program by 50%. And that's primarily why the DoD funded this fighter in peacetime when we didn't have an identified enemy. You know, like when we used to have the Russians and the, yeah.
I'm sorry, what was the name of that aircraft?
This is the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. It's the one that's just been having the battery problems. And this other one down, the military one, is the F-35. And this one's built by Lockheed, and this one's built by Boeing. And then the other large aircraft company is called Airbus, and they're out of France. And I don't know where they're at with the technology. We can't share it internationally because not only does it make aircraft more reliable, it makes their weapons more reliable too. So we don't share this technology.
McDonnell Douglas just got a contract, didn't it?
Well, McDonnell Douglas got bought by Boeing. It's now part of Boeing. Yes, Boeing wins contracts on a regular basis. In others, yes, they're always winning. Lockheed, they all do continuously. Nobody within the mental health community agrees on a single model that can explain what causes mental illness, how to treat it, how to cure it. And so what we did with this work was we proposed that we use the fight-or-flight response as the model to be able to understand the cause, the prevention, and the cure for mental illness. And so that was really the basis of this work. Was we want the mental health community to look at the fight-or-flight response solely as the cause and cure for mental health.
Can you define fight or flight?
What happens is your subconscious detects that there's a threat, triggers the release of both cortisol and adrenaline, which then immediately is flushed through our body, which makes us be able to run faster, jump higher, be able to either run away from a threat or stand and fight if we need to. Adrenaline and cortisol are toxic. When the body developed the fight or flight response, the presence of cortisol and adrenaline was never intended to be long-term. Remember, just 100 years ago, we were a farm-based community. Most of us didn't live in cities. We didn't have to go to work and face things at work. We were able to live on a farm. If we saw an animal out on the farm, we'd run into the house and get away with it. That was just 100 years ago. Well, now the great bulk of the United States, we all live in cities. We all go to work every day, and sometimes we go to jobs that can be very threatening. Sometimes we live in environments that are very threatening. And as a consequence of that, our fight or flight response is on more than it ever was intended to be. And when your body is exposed to toxic chemicals, including cortisol and adrenaline, and all the other drugs that those trigger, the generation of those in order for us to defend ourselves, long term, it causes our body to age prematurely, as I showed earlier with the pictures of the presidents. That's what's going on.
Is that what alcohol does?
No, alcohol does not. No, alcohol works completely. Now, a little bit of alcohol is good because it allows you to relax, but then too much alcohol is also toxic. 5 major mental illnesses that I'm talking about here, just depression, major depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. They were all described as a brain disorder. And then the list of symptoms that you could have as a result of having any one of those brain disorders. Well, we couldn't do anything with that in our work. I mean, what we're interested in knowing is what causes the brain disorder. Just saying that a brain disorder causes mental illness doesn't say what causes mental illness, because a brain disorder is a general term. It's like saying a broken arm is an injury. And you tell somebody, oh, you have an injury, well, you're not telling them they got a broken arm. So describing a mental illness as a brain disorder is technically accurate, but you're not defining, it's not enough information for us to work on. So what we had to do, and this of course is whether or not there was any damage done to the brain that we knew of, we had to work to a much more stringent definition of what these 5 mental illnesses were, and I'll end up going over what those definitions are. And as a result, in everyday conversation, we speak in very general terms, and we often use the wrong terms to describe mental illnesses. For instance, if people are kind of looking down or looking sad or kind of dragging, somebody say, oh, gee, you look depressed. Well, using that kind of terminology causes us to be confused. What the heck is mental illness? If you're using the wrong terminology, depression itself is the inability to feel. And it's a sort of it's a way the brain, the subconscious communicates with the conscious. Is it tries to make you a little bit uncomfortable. It's telling you that you're doing something wrong. It doesn't tell you what. You get to figure that out at the conscious level. But the way we describe depression and these other mental illnesses are the subconscious telling the conscious, you're doing something wrong I don't like and I want you to change it. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the kind of communications where it tells you what it wants you to do. You kind of have to figure that out on your own. You kind of trial and error. Yeah, and so, yes.
I've been wondering what you were just, can you backtrack just a little bit? Because you mentioned that 100 years ago.
Yes.
And so as we evolved from back then to something else, and we are evolving now.
We are continuing to evolve. It's just that 100 years isn't enough time for our fight or flight response to evolve into a city life environment. Our primitive brain is 100% the way it was about 1 million years ago. The primitive brain we share with all the other mammals is virtually identical. They have this.
You predict it will take, now that we're making prediction, how long do you predict it will take?
Oh, I don't think we would adapt. It would take probably hundreds of thousands of years of living in the city to have our primitive brain evolve into tuning down the fight or flight response. Our lifestyle will change by that time into something else. The city life that we know of may not last a whole lot longer. That's more likely to change than our brain evolving, improving our fight or flight response. So I just wanted to complain about the current definitions, and I even brought some documents from the Santa Cruz County defining, the mental illnesses as a brain disorder, which we couldn't do anything with. So we had to work on that. And so I'm here not as a doctor, a medical doctor, or as a psychologist or as a therapist. I'm here as an electrical engineer, as a physicist, and as a mathematician. And I'm going to explain mental illness in terms of communication sciences from the discipline of electrical engineering, and then the predictive sciences that I was just talking about, where it's called PHM, for predicting, preventing, and curing mental illness. And so what is communication sciences? It's about communicating is about getting your intended message received. Although we talk to each other on a daily basis, almost on a continuous basis, that doesn't mean that our message is actually getting heard by the other person. Communication science is getting the intended message heard. That's why it's called a science. And everything else, most of the time when we're talking amongst ourselves, we're generally getting, if we can get 50% of the intended message that the other person is giving out, we're doing really good. Our communications vocally is very poor. We have this language we call English, in which each word oftentimes has many definitions. Each sentence can be interpreted quite often many different ways, paragraphs. And so how do you communicate, how do you get your message across when you have a language that is so subjective? In the field of communication sciences, that's how we design communication systems electronically. What message we intend to get out is received, and if it's not, we get to know that the message that we wanted didn't get received, so we get to try again. And that's what communication sciences is, the ability to have the intended message received. And so I'm applying that in the communications between the subconscious and the conscious. The theories of communications that we use in electrical engineering. And so some of our assumptions was that the brain communicates from the subconscious to the conscious and externally through the conscious mind. There are many life forms that don't have a conscious. They're simply subconscious, and they work strictly instinctual, and they're able to survive and thrive. We have what we call the conscious mind, and it's the subconscious interface to the physical world around us. That's one. The other one is our senses. And we have the sense of what? Sight, hearing, touch, And of course, our nervous system is communicating with our brain as well. And our conscious is the interface to the physical world, to our subconscious. So what I'm claiming here is that the subconscious communicates to the conscious, and it's only one way. That is, the conscious mind isn't able to communicate. Now, it's able to send information to the subconscious. That's the confusing part. But when you want to communicate with the subconscious, what's the best way to do it? Is to talk. Because the subconscious is paying attention when you're talking. Right? I mean, in fact, I'm going to show you I'll get to some block diagrams. How we deal with communications in electronic equipment. I apply that same theory to the brain. Now, here's what I was talking about. This is what's called, in electrical engineering, we use block diagrams. This is a simplified block diagram for a computer. Here's your input where you're sitting at the keyboard typing into the computer. This is the computer itself. You got data storage, your hard drive. This is the RAM, random access memory. Here's your arithmetic logic unit, the central processing. This is all the stuff that's inside this computer right here, in the computer that you work with. And this is called a simplified block diagram. The output would be what I see on this screen right here. So for a computer, this is a block diagram. And the way the data moves in between these different elements, the way they're sized is based on the theory used in electrical engineering that says if you're working with digital data, you can't you start getting errors based upon the ratio between the energy in each digital bit versus the energy in the noise. If you got noise in the data, it corrupts it, and you have to know what your limitations are so you don't generate any errors. And so in electrical engineering, we have mathematics that allows us to know what's the maximum amount of data throughput on any line. And if we weren't using digital data like on the computer, but we were doing it the old-fashioned way called analog, we worry about something called the signal-to-noise ratio. I don't know if anybody's ever heard that. Those are the two key design parameters when you're dealing with electrical hardware and communications in any system. Applying those principles over to the simplified block diagram for the brain, I say here's the subconscious for the brain. Here's the inputs to the subconscious. And what I'm showing here is the inputs from the eyes, the ears, the nose, the taste, and the nervous system all going, guess where? Into the fight or flight response. And the fight or flight response is one element of the subconscious. And then from there, data is filtered and selected to be sent to this is the conscious mind right here. I don't know if anybody can see it, but that says the conscious mind. That's what I'm pointing out here, is that the subconscious receives far more information to it than what we get access to in our conscious mind. And that's what this block diagram is meant to show. Here's the inputs, just like on the computer. Here's the output. The output here is what we call our reality. And that our reality is generated by our conscious from the data that's sent up to us through the subconscious. And my point is that the subconscious has access to far more data than what we get to privy in our conscious level. This is a chart used to show, this is meant to be the electromagnetic spectrum. This is visible light. This is the electromagnetic spectrum goes on for infinity in both directions in terms of frequencies. Visible light occurs right here in this part right here, visible light. Well, there's also ultraviolet and infrared, right? And what we believe happens is that our subconscious has access to both ultraviolet and infrared information that our conscious doesn't. And this is the sound frequencies showing on the spectrum of energy for sound. We get this part right here. Well, you still have supersonic and you still have subsonic, which we believe that the subconscious has access to as well. And so the reason I say that is this is a chart showing other mammals and what frequencies that they're able to hear. This, I think, is the whales. These are different, all the different mammals, and these are the different frequencies that they're able to hear and be privy to. My point is that other mammals have access to other parts of the spectrum, both in light and in sound, that we don't. So proving that already nature has given mammals the ability to hear and see things that our conscious mind doesn't. And so it's likely that we as people have that same ability at the subconscious level, but not the conscious level, since mammals are already doing it. As you know, our DNA is built on, from previous ancestors. And so we carry the traits, we can see where we used to have a tail and what other things, from different stages of the embryo as it goes through. We learn about that in biology. Why is the space program and communication sciences suitable for defining the cause and cure for mental illness? I'm trying to justify why the space program is okay to use. I alluded to this earlier, back in the 1950s when we were thrown into the Cold War with the Russians, we were under so much a hurry to try and develop an ICBM with a nuclear bomb on top. Why? Because the Russians already had one. And in that rush to generate one, all the decisions that were made ended up producing rockets and satellites that fail on a regular basis. Approximately 25% of everything that's launched in space fails within the first year. And that's a year in my tax money. Okay, 1 out of 4 fail within the first year. You're talking multi-billion-dollar rockets and satellites. 1 out of 4. And the reason is because after they developed this process to make these ICBMs and rockets, and even though they failed, they never looked back to see all those decisions that we made in a hurry, were they the right ones? They never went back and looked to see, well, gee, maybe what was called concurrent engineering, doing everything at the same time, maybe that wasn't such a wise thing to do. It took the industry, the aerospace and defense industry, 50 years to figure out that they made one wrong decision. And the US government, what they did in order to be able to have these ICBMs to counter the Russian threat was they knew that about 5 out of 10 wouldn't work. So what'd they do? They bought twice as many of what they needed because they knew half of them were going to fail. And so every time they built a new ICBM, they'd figure out a failure rate to be maybe 3 or 4 out of 10. Well, they would buy that much more to factor out the fact that so many of them were going to fail. And so that's, instead of telling the companies, find out why your equipment is failing prematurely, the US government said, we'll buy whatever you make and we'll accept whatever losses that we suffer, and we'll counter that by simply buying more. And guess what? Industry said, we love that idea. That sounds great to us. And you know what? They never complained. Industry never once complained that the government was buying too much equipment from them and too much equipment that failed. In fact, it became acceptable. They generated these excuses. Well, when you're working with something so complex as a jet fighter or as a rocket or as a very complex satellite, you should expect these things to fail every once in a while. Well, 25% of the time is a little bit more than once in a while. And so what our work now is to convince NASA and the Air Force to adopt this new approach, this PHM, in the design of everything in the military and everything that NASA buys in order to make it safer and reliable, especially for the astronauts. Yeah.
What's that called when you keep making the same mistake, expecting the same?
It's called insanity.
Yeah.
Yeah, we call that insanity. And both NASA and the military and even the commercial space world continues to build the rockets and the satellites exactly the same way, expecting it not to fail, expecting a different result.
Expecting the same result.
Expecting different results. Absolutely. What's that?
Is that called remonstrance?
I don't know. And so within the military, down at Space Division in the Air Force, where they actually procure the rockets and the satellites, when the general gets promoted to that spot, that's usually a place where they retire from, and they never get a promotion from the Space Division, because while they're in charge of that facility, they're launching satellites and rockets that are failing, exploding, and they don't get promoted to the next level. Even though it's not their responsibility, they're the head of that facility, and the buck stops with them, and as a consequence, once you get assigned there, you know that you're going to be retiring pretty soon, because eventually one or two of those rockets or satellites are going to fail, making them look bad to their bosses, and they won't get picked for the next level of promotion. And so this was meant just to say that in the industry, we know the companies that build parts tell the companies, some of our parts are going to fail prematurely. We guarantee it. We promise you that some of our parts are going to fail prematurely. And the industry does absolutely nothing. There's no measurement that they take before PHM that would have identified the equipment that's going to fail prematurely. PHM in the aerospace industry is used to identify the equipment that's going to fail prematurely and how much longer life it's going to have, much as a medical doctor does with his patients. As I mentioned earlier with the medical industry, this is about, again, repeating what I said about the medical industry, how they use it to diagnose and prognose their patients. Well, now in the aerospace and defense industry, we use PHM to understand the cause, the prevention, and cure for premature failure, and we're going to apply that, the aerospace industry is now going to apply that to curing mental illness as well. This is to describe how unsafe getting and working in space is. In 1990, a company called the Aerospace Corporation, which is a fully federally funded company that is a technical resource for the Air Force, decided to find out how unreliable their equipment was. And what they found out was that when anything that they launch up into space, this is the military, that there's a 70% likelihood that it's going to fail within 45 days. A 70%, that was done in 1990. And nothing was done about it. This was just simply, well, here's the rate at which to expect. This isn't the rate at which we should use to motivate us to fix it. It's just, this is what we should expect, you know. And if it would have been me, I would have said, well, maybe we should do some research to figure out why this is happening. But because they had experienced it for so long, decade after decade after decade, they simply accepted it as normal. It became the norm. 25% failing every year became a normal. And so they had no reason to use this information to motivate them to change whatever it was that they were doing. No, 70% likelihood of it failing within 45 days once it got into space. And so this is a chart going back to 1970. The red, this is a scale of how many satellites, rockets, space missions that got launched per year for NASA, the commercial, and the military space communities. This is the total number that was launched each year. You know, here's like 12, 14, 16, 18, started lowering down, 50. This is, you know, for every year out to about 2006. And this just extends all the way out. The red ones are the number that failed for that year, failed prematurely. Out of, say, pick up here, say 18, they launched 18 this year. They had 8 premature, 8 didn't work. They launched, out of the 18, 8 failed. And that would have been either paid for by the American taxpayer, you and I, or the insurance company for the commercial space industry. They insure, in the commercial space industry, they have insurance companies that insure the launches. And so that's saying that there was a whole lot of premature failures, and that's why PHM is so important, as prognostics and health management, to be able to identify what equipment is going to fail prematurely is so important for the aerospace community. And so here's some pictures of rockets and satellites that failed between 2010, I think 2011, and maybe 2012. Here's a $120 million for that satellite, 125, 150 million. This was a GPS satellite, one of the ones I showed you that I was responsible for back in the 1980s. This was an $83 million satellite, but this one, they were able to do a software upload and get it to work correctly. This one, they were eventually able to get it in the right spot. I think it lost about 3 or 4 years of useful life as a consequence of it. It was designed to work maybe 15 years, but it's only going to work about 10 or 11 because they had to use up some of the fuel to get it where it belonged, because the rocket did, the big engine on it that it was supposed to use to put it where it belonged, it didn't work. It failed prematurely. And so they had to use little bitty rocket motors that were a lot more inefficient, wasted a whole lot more fuel, about 3 or 4 years worth. So it shortened the life of this. This one was $2 billion. This military, this was a secure communication satellite used by the military. And so these were just some, you know, these are just some pictures of it, give you an idea of what they look like. And they're failing now as we speak, you know, as they're launching. 75% of the stuff that's up there doesn't work anymore. It's all pollution. And it's still up there. But I don't know of any around here where they would need to bury them. Usually what they do is they shoot it, they launch them up over the oceans, and when they explode and they fail, they go down into the oceans. And they're down there, and they stay down there. Now, Amazon.com, the guy who owns Jeff Bezos, Amazon.com, he just went and retrieved the rocket engines that were used on the Saturn V to launch astronauts to the moon back in the 1960s and 70s. He hired a shipping company to go out and retrieve the old rocket engines, because he's going to try to refurbish them and build a new rocket and launch them and reuse them. And say, pardon?
Underwater search and salvage?
They salvage it, yeah. He's actually got them up and he's got them stored somewhere. There was an article in last week's paper that showed them.
There's a place up in Bellevue that does that.
Yeah, it does that. But there's the ocean bottom is littered with American and Russian satellites and rockets that never made it. This is a chart that had been developed back in the 1950s. All these failures would not have occurred. This chart is used by electrical engineers to understand that all the parts and equipment degrade, age at different rates. And had the engineers known at that time that the parts inside the electrical and mechanical equipment aged at different rates, and some of them aged prematurely and failed within a few days or a few weeks or a few months, and that when they did age prematurely, you could actually see them in the diagnostic data that was coming down from the equipment, that we would have adopted PHM 50 years ago, and I wouldn't be here talking to you today. But this chart just came out recently that explains the premature aging that occurs inside electronic equipment as the cause for all the failure that's been occurring over the last 40 or 50 years. And when you go to the store and you buy a stereo unit and you bring it home and you think, how did that thing ever make it out of the factory and to my house, and then it failed? And that's because the parts that was used in that stereo worked while it was still at the factory, but one or two of them was aging faster than all the rest, and when you got it home and plugged it in, and it failed, there was no way to identify, factories had no way to identify which parts are going to fail prematurely until now, until PHM. So if the new factories, if they start adopting this technology, they'll be able to improve the reliability. This down here is data that comes from it's test data that comes from inside the equipment. It's called telemetry. And it can be voltage, it can be current, it could be temperature. And what happens is when the parts, if there's a part inside, this would be like transistors, diodes, and triodes from this board over here. And this shows the rate at which they're aging. The performance is changing the longer that they're on. And when one part ages at some point, it causes an interaction in the circuit that the circuit was never designed to handle. And that is called a transient, non-repeatable transient event. And so it shows up in the data. And early on in the space program, when we saw these things, we thought that was noise. And we classified it as noise and just overlook it, forget it, because we didn't understand that parts were aging prematurely inside the equipment, causing this transient event. Think of it as like, remember when the husband used to go to work and the wife would stay home and she'd borrow the car and she'd come and tell her husband, she'd go, honey, I heard this clunk in the transmission. And her husband would say, well, what happened? And she said, oh, nothing, I just heard the clunk. And so, 3 weeks later, the transmission would fail. Nobody tied that clunk that the wife heard to the end of life of the transmission, because it was so long. It could take weeks or months to happen. That clunk is the equivalent in a mechanical system like a transmission, is equivalent to this little glitch in the data that we used to diagnose as noise. In the aircraft industry, when the pilot says, oh, I heard something funny out, when I was flying, and he tells the maintenance guys, hey man, I heard this noise, right? So he brings in the jet aircraft and all the mechanics take everything apart. It's not repeatable. They can't repeat it in test. And they're called, they have lots of names for them. They're called, after they put the aircraft, they do all the checking and everything, they put it back out and it's called a no failure found, an NFF, or a no failure identified, an NFI, or a retest OK, an RTOK. And nobody had ever connected those transient events with the end of life of the equipment until now. After all these years of flying jet aircraft and having all these transient events occurred, it's PHM that, in the science of PHM, links those transients with the end of life with 100% certainty. That's how we predict the future behavior of equipment reliably. This is a picture of a satellite I was responsible for over when I worked at UC Berkeley, called Extreme Ultraviolet Explorer. It's a sister ship to the Hubble telescope, only it operates in extreme ultraviolet wavelengths. These are telescopes here, and this thing cost $300 million to build, about $100 million to launch into space, roughly about a $500 million program. And what that satellite is designed to make is this little picture right here. This is a global map of every source of extreme ultraviolet energy, light, that's in the universe. A 360-degree global map. And this is called an all-sky map. And NASA puts up satellites with telescopes at different energy, X-ray, ultraviolet. They all produce this, they are all required to produce this one map called an all-sky map. At the frequency that they're interested, ultraviolet, infrared, and invisible light. Hubble, are you familiar with the Hubble telescope? That's visible light, and it has sensors on there for other frequencies as well. But that went up for visible light, and NASA puts up these other telescopes for the other energy, other frequencies. But $400 million to generate this little map right here, this little picture. Those are sources of extreme ultraviolet energy in the sky somewhere. The cameras on board here, the telescopes, sees the energy, and then it's plotted on this graph.
The energy could be anything from a planet to a star.
It can be, we don't know, it's too far away. All we know, it's a source of extreme ultraviolet light. Just like when we look at it in visible light, it's so far away we can't tell what it is. We're pretty sure it's a sun, but we actually can't see it, but we assume because it's visible light, it must be a sun. What happens is other scientists come to this facility where this satellite was, and we'll pick a target and hire the satellite to stare at it to get more data, and then write a research paper on it, is what happens.
Can you get source from the ultraviolet energy?
These are all the sources in the sky at the extreme ultraviolet frequency, and that's like 80 angstroms to 800 angstroms. That's called the wavelength. And that's called extreme ultraviolet. There's ultraviolet, extreme ultraviolet. Pardon?
Ultraviolet?
We don't use it. I think it causes a sunburn on us, doesn't it? Ultraviolet light? Yeah, UAV and UVB.
What's the benefit of
For science, understanding how the universe is made up. We see it generally at visible light with our eyes. But there's a lot more going on in the universe than what our little eyes can see. And so this is NASA's attempt at gathering that data to help us understand what's going on everywhere, not just in the visible spectrum.
Is there life on other planets?
We don't know yet. They're looking. We haven't found any yet that I know of. We found lots of water. We found water on the moon, or even found water in Mercury. Mercury's that planet right by the sun that should be boiling. They found ice in the shade on Mercury. We're always changing our understanding with the more data that NASA gets from these satellites. Now, when I talk about doing using PHM on the equipment on satellites, this is the result of the analysis. These are 3 gyroscopes that was on the satellite, on the EUV satellite, Gyro A, Gyro B, and Gyro C. And what we did was we used the processing of PHM to illustrate this data right here on Gyro B. And when the engineers first looked at this data before processing using PHM, they missed it. They said, oh, that was noise. But they didn't catch it, so they didn't make any diagnosis. It seemed to be operating fine. It should last, for a long time. We processed it using our PHM, and we were able to come up with this. And then we predicted the remaining usable life based on this. And I think we predicted something like 5.1 months of remaining life, and it failed after like 4.5 months. So the mere fact that we could identify what was going to be failing, in days and weeks and months to come was a new ability for equipment. And the fact that we were so close in our prediction, we guessed 5 months and it was like 4.5, so that's really pretty good. So that's an example with 3. This is the current, the electrical current that the gyro draws over time. This is like 3 months worth of data from these gyros, Gyro A, Gyro B current, and Gyro C current. And again, when the engineers saw this data spread out over time, they just assumed it was noise and ignored it. And so here's a same kind of processing that was done for motor current on the gyro, on a different gyroscope at a different, I'm sorry, at the same gyroscope at a different time. And when we processed it, this is the part that showed that the equipment had suffered a transient event and it was going to be failing, and then we predicted the remaining usable life and it failed over here. So this is time scale down here, and this is the motor current. And so these are like the standard deviation and the mean, just to show that this glitch in the data would have been seen in the standard deviation and the processing, if you did a look at the mean of the data, it would have been visible in all three efforts if an engineer would have looked at it. That's all. And so, as I mentioned before, the combination of the conscious mind and the subconscious mind makes up our brain. But the way that we understand how much control and how important our subconscious is illustrated best by this picture, where this little tiny bit of this great big glacier is what we would consider the size of our brain that's used to create the conscious mind. And you can see that the subconscious mind is far larger and very deep. And some people even say that really only 5% of our brain is, as little as 5% of our brain is dedicated to the conscience. And so when I started this out, I said I was going to explain how it was important for us to worry about our subconscious, to help our mental health, to worry about taking care of our subconscious, using our conscious mind, because it is really in control. It's a trick of the brain that we believe that we're consciously in control of ourselves. And it's a trick that gets us into a lot of trouble. Yes?
Our conscious mind is biased for itself. Our consciousness is
yes, it's biased. It doesn't want to believe that something else is in control. And so what is important to the subconscious is control. The conscious mind was created as an interface to the physical world for the subconscious mind. It relays data into the subconscious mind for one purpose only: self-preservation. The whole subconscious is about self-preservation. And so when the subconscious mind sees the conscious mind doing things that it doesn't like, it does things to try to get the conscious mind's attention. And that's what I'm going to be talking about more now, is looking at mental illness as the subconscious, the symptoms of mental illness, as the subconscious mind trying to communicate with the conscious mind. It says, you're doing something I don't like. Please change it. Take action. Do something different. I can't tell you what you're doing wrong because I can't communicate with you that way. Yes?
We recently had someone here looking at psychosis and spirituality, and they had a clip with Rufus May where he was talking about learning to talk with the voices.
Yes.
And learning for the conscious and the subconscious to talk with each other.
Yes. And I will go further and say that I will describe schizophrenia as the subconscious mind is so excuse my language, at the conscious mind of that person, that the subconscious mind is is physically removing the conscious mind, and is now trying to interface with the physical world without the conscious mind. And of course it's not made to do that. And that's why when we see the behavior of people with schizophrenia without medication, it's so bizarre, because we're interfacing with the conscious mind is gone for the schizophrenic. We're trying to communicate with the subconscious, and it doesn't know how to do it. And we don't know how to do it. And that's why it's so bizarre. Yes?
Did you say that the communication between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind varies from person to person?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Very genetic based, yeah. But that relationship where you've got the majority of the brain working at the subconscious level is the same, but how much it varies with individuals, yeah. So that's what I wanted to mention about the voices and what important the voices are. Yeah. So this is the model. Why we needed a model. Why is a model important in mental health? To have a model, and why we proposed to use the fight or flight response as the model for mental illness. And so because, again, within the mental health community, there's no uniform agreement on what model to use. And so I was just trying to point out that this is the funding outlay used by Santa Cruz County for mental health, and 100% of that money goes with treating the symptoms of mental health. 100%. And who's going to be doing the research on the cure? Who's going to be doing the research on the prevention if all the money's spent on treating the symptoms? And so we looked to academia to do the research, but it hasn't come yet. And as a result, what we're doing is, as people become mentally ill more often, in fact, the rate of mental illness is growing. I saw an article in JAMA that said that 50% of today's population will have a mental illness in their lifetime requiring medication, and so, but sometime before they die. And so that, and that's a lot higher than it was, 30 years ago. But what the FOFR, with the fight or flight response as the model for mental illness does, it allows everybody to agree on what's causing mental illness, and so everybody can work and come up with uniform answers and responses. And so, just to hammer in this idea about my statement that the subconscious is trying to communicate with the conscious, in the physical body outside of the brain, you have the nervous system and the skin and everything to communicate with the conscious that says when you've done something wrong, right, with an injury. Well, we have what's called an endoskeleton, right, on our human body, but the brain, it's surrounded in a skull with an exoskeleton. And so it doesn't have a nervous system to communicate with the conscious mind. It's got the conscious mind embedded in the subconscious. And so this was just my attempt at trying to explain, hammering again, that the symptoms of mental illness is the way that the subconscious is communicating with the conscious, because it has no other way. It's locked. They're locked together. Unlike the rest of our body, when we injure our foot, there's communication paths that tell our conscious mind that we've injured our foot. Well, when you've got your brain locked in the skull, the technique that the brain developed was what we consider the symptoms of mental illness, to communicate with the conscious mind that says you're doing something wrong. You're doing something that the subconscious decides is threatening to the person. Yes? Let me say that there has been no images developed yet that can identify the energy that it takes to create the conscious mind. We haven't seen it. Can't find it. Either it is so low, or it's spread out throughout the whole brain. We don't know. Haven't seen it. Now we've seen areas of the brain. We know now that thoughts and ideas can be transferred by recording the synapses as they fire. You can record them and play them back. You can take away and provide thoughts to brains by recording the synapses as they fire. And so we can see that happen. We do an MR. We can see that energy. What part of the brain lights up, as they say, when it's processing that data. We can't see the conscious. We haven't been able to see the conscious yet. We don't know.
What would therefore be the explanation of communication with all other consciousness, like they have reported communication of plants and such?
The way they communicate, yes, they communicate in a different way than we do. Obviously, they don't have a mouth and different things, but they have over the eons developed ways in which they communicate, usually chemically. Plants, for instance, communicate with each other chemically. There are life forms that don't, especially in the microbiology, we don't believe viruses or bacteria have a brain or consciousness, and yet bacteria is the most successful life form on the earth. There's more bacteria than any other life form, and as far as we know of it, there's no brain or gray matter there, and yet so you don't need it to be successful on the earth. A consciousness and a brain the size that we have. In our work, we assume that the brain and the nervous system was a closed system, and we use the concepts of what I've been talking about, communication sciences, to identify the cause of the symptoms of mental illness as a communications problem between the subconscious and the conscious mind. And so we say that in our work, we assume that the communications with the subconscious to the conscious was one way only, through the and then through the senses and the nervous system for the subconscious. All the data goes to the subconscious, and then only a small portion is thrown up to the conscious. We asked and answered the question, what happens when the conscious ignores the communications from the subconscious? What we came up with in our work was mental illness, the symptoms of mental illness. It is the way that the subconscious is trying to get the attention. And there's a lot of warnings that indicate that you're living, you're doing things in your life that your subconscious doesn't like. What we say is that the fight or flight response causes the conscious to experience difficulty. We call it depression. But what it does is, depression is the inability to feel. For whatever reason, oftentimes young people are raised in a pretty dangerous environment, and they can't get out of it. And and so as a survival mechanism, a psychological survival mechanism, they may distance themselves from their feelings of fear and fright and just knowing it's too much to know what's going around them, and it's just too much for them to handle, and they develop these survival skills, psychological and physical, so to get them through the childhood, hopefully into adulthood, where they can get rid of whatever was going on that was terrible in their life. And so if a person, as a young person or even as an adult, develops that distancing themselves from their emotions and from their feelings, they're destroying the communications path between the subconscious and the conscious. You need professional help to come out of that, to overcome what you did as a child to survive. If you do get depressed, we have antidepressants. But when you're given antidepressants, you don't get the talk that says, hey, now you need to go to talk therapy to reconnect with your feelings and your emotions. But doctors will gladly prescribe you antidepressants, and that's it, and that's all they do. And so you go home and you take the antidepressants, and you're not forced to make any changes in your life because the antidepressants help you feel better. It undermines what your subconscious is trying to do. It's trying to make you feel uncomfortable, to make changes in your life. The antidepressants now nullifies that, and so you continue to live in a lifestyle in which your subconscious, for whatever reason, doesn't like and wants you to change. If for whatever reason you ignore the signs of depression, the subconscious steps it up to major depression. And those are a whole different host of symptoms on top of the symptoms that it gave you with depression. Then you go get treated for major depression, and what do you get? You get more antidepressants, right? Again, undermining the communications between your subconscious and your conscious. Okay, so then what happens is, quite often, the subconscious decides, hey, my life is being threatened. I'm in danger here, and it creates anxiety. When you get anxiety, that is your subconscious saying, I see myself dying. That's what anxiety is about. And so what do people do when they get anxiety? They get medication so that they don't feel the anxiety, and they continue living in the same way. Okay, so there's three things that your subconscious has done trying to get your attention, trying to get you to make changes in your life. Depression, major depression, anxiety. And you've ignored, and say the person's ignored all of those. Finally, it says, the subconscious says, hey, this ain't working, I got to do something severe. And so what does it do? One of the things I didn't go over very well was the fight or flight response is the most powerful function of the brain. It can control virtually almost every cell of the body anytime it decides it's necessary for your self-preservation. And so what the next step after major depression and anxiety is, it actually changes the chemistry. The subconscious starts changing the chemistry in your brain, causing even more, known as what we call bipolar disorder, where you've got these potentially severe mood swings. Or, on the other hand, depends on genetics, you might get schizophrenia. There's not a for sure path of which way you're going to go. Okay? But what the brain has done is, internally, it has caused brain damage. And we can get drugs for that. We can get onto a whole regimen of drugs to treat the symptoms of that. But fundamentally, it's the brain, the subconscious, so frustrated that you haven't you haven't paid attention to your chapped lips, to your unable to sleep at night, to your zits, growing all over your body, to your allergies, to all these subtle warnings, to the symptoms of depression, the symptoms of major depression, symptoms of anxiety. Hey, it finally just says, okay, now I'm going to shake you up a lot with changing the chemistry of your brain. And so eventually, if it gets to the point where it causes schizophrenia, what schizophrenia does is it changes the reality that the subconscious sees. You can put a gun in the face of a schizophrenic and that subconscious won't see the gun. It changes the reality so it doesn't see the danger. And by doing that, it feels safe. By distorting reality so much, it removes the ability for it to see the danger, and it is more comfortable in that environment. You and I don't like it because they behave a lot differently than we do without drugs. Yes?
So isn't that why people commit suicide?
Well, suicide is another one of those messages from your subconscious that says, there's something wrong, man. I want you to kill yourself. Isn't that kind of a severe message from you? I mean, that says, man, there's really something wrong in your life. You're really doing things wrong. If your subconscious is giving you the ideas of suicide, that somehow dying is going to relieve your problems, that ought to be recognized as a severe message from your subconscious to get help, to make changes, to do something different than what you're saying. You're doing something wrong in a big way, and to get help. Our society, our culture doesn't allow us to make a lot of times the changes that need to be changed. And sometimes it could be a new spouse, it could be a family member, a parent, pardon? It could be the broken family, and a lot of times it's things that you don't have any control over. You can't make the changes, but your subconscious doesn't care. It wants you to change, and it doesn't care about the real world. It's just worried about its safety. And our problem is that we now live in a society where to make the changes that are needed to keep us healthy mentally, it's very difficult. This is a little summary of the messages from our subconscious. We know them as feelings or emotions: happiness, sad, fear, guilt, anger, love, and even feeling embarrassed. And then these are, when you put those messages from the subconscious into context of what you're doing in your daily life, you come up with these other things. Under happy, glad, pleased, surprised, sad. Under fear, there's shock, afraid, confused, disbelief. Those are terms that we used when we put these feelings in the context of what's going on in our life. That's how we arrive at what those things mean is by putting these messages. And you can, your subconscious can send up several at the same time. Fear and guilt and anger, and boy, it's jumbled up, all together. So as I mentioned before, the single purpose of the fight or flight response was really to, self-preservation, to either run away or stand and fight. And this is a picture of an image showing the brain damage that occurs from cortisol and adrenaline, overexposure to cortisol and adrenaline for the brain. The fight or flight response, when it's activated too long, causes, in addition to the changing the chemistry of the brain, cortisol and adrenaline is destroying it also, causing it to shrink. So it's a double whammo. You're getting chemistry changed by the subconscious, as well as these toxic chemicals that are present around your brain and your body too long. We can't repair the brain. It takes drugs to balance it out. But what we can do, which I'll get to in a little bit, is with the shrinkage of the brain, you can start reversing it by using meditation. There's been, and I'll be talking about that, there's a lot of papers that's been published that shows the possible growth in brain size. That doesn't reverse the brain damage that the subconscious did to get you either bipolar or schizophrenia, but it does get some size back and relaxation things. Talk therapy helps you reconnect with your emotions and your messages from your subconscious up to your conscious. That's what cognitive therapy is about. So I'm telling all this back to what causes mental illness. As I meant, and I'm applying this to space as an education, and so as I mentioned before, we had to redefine a lot of things. And so these were 4 very important words to us: what a threat was, what stress was, what stressors are, and what triggers are. And we had to redefine those for our work, because we talk about them in general conversations, and quite often we mix them up and get them confused. And in engineering, we can't have multiple definitions. We work with a single definition. In engineering, 2 plus 2 is 4. That's it. It can be 4.0000, but it's still 4. In engineering and science, generally there's only one answer, to each problem. And unlike the rest of the world, which sometimes you can have multiple answers to a single question, in engineering and science, you have to work with one. And so especially in communication sciences, we had to come up with our own definitions for a threat. And as we identify the threat, we say that it's defined by each person's fight or flight response. What might be a threat to one person's fight or flight response may not be considered a threat by another person's fight or flight response. So that's the way we look at threat. And stress occurs with the release of cortisol and adrenaline. As defined, you can't do it from the outside. It's the brain defines what stress is and then releases the cortisol and the adrenaline. Now, if we had wires that were put into the brain that we could detect when that's released, then we would know on the outside. And typically we don't get to realize that cortisol and adrenaline's been released a long time until damage occurs from those toxic chemicals. And by that time, it's kind of almost too late. And so again, I just wanted to point out that we had to define these things very, very uniquely for our application. Common examples of our body's response to stressors that are often missed or misunderstood are, allergies. Remember what I said was that the fight or flight response can do anything it wants. It can create migraine headaches. It can cause allergies. It can do anything that it decides makes sense to it in order for you to communicate with the conscious mind. And so what we were doing is we're interpreting these kinds of things as indications that the fight or flight response is trying to let people know that it's doing things that it doesn't like. Heartburn, for instance. When you're doing things in a big way that the subconscious doesn't like, quite often the digestive tract goes into a sympathetic response with in anticipation of a whole bunch of junk coming at you, and you start up with like heartburn and digestive tract problems, diarrhea, hemorrhoids, those kinds of things. Those all can be associated with a sympathetic response of the fight or flight response, saying it's anticipating a whole bunch of stuff dangerous stuff coming at you, and there's a sympathetic response by the digestive tract. Skin allergies, colds and flu, those are all little messages. Chapped lips. You see a TV, there people would always be rubbing, on their dry lips. They were wondering why their lips were dry, and they were saying how they were addicted to just chapped lips. Well, it wasn't that they were having a very stressful life and they weren't making the changes necessary for their fight or flight response to turn off drying out their lips. Okay, so that's why they had to keep putting on the lip balm. And then for triggers in the fight or flight response, high or low blood pressure. I was talking with a gentleman earlier about high blood pressure as a result of triggers. Triggers you can end up with, obviously perspiration, insomnia, heart palpitations, anxiety, and again, depression as a result. Triggers can trigger depression, which is turning off your awareness of the messages from your subconscious. Mood swings, irritability, those are all things that can happen as a trigger to what is going on in your life, in the life of what happens in space. Fibromyalgia is not well known. They're not sure if it's a nerve issue or now. Some of the drugs that have come out tweak the chemistry in the brain, and for some people they get relief by tweaking that. It's done much as antidepressants tweak the chemistry in the brain. Some of the drugs tweak it and it works for fibromyalgia, but for other people it doesn't work. So it's a very complex thing for fibromyalgia. Yeah, that pain, that constant pain. Now, in Astronaut, Captain Lisa Nowak, she was in the press about 5 or 6 years ago. She was an astronaut, and she's the woman who was in Houston, Texas, and she found out her ex-boyfriend had gotten a new girlfriend, and she drove 900 miles and was planning to kill the girl. And so her name was Captain Lisa Nowak, and she was a NASA astronaut. She had been in space for at least 6 months. In space, Anytime you leave gravity, you lose about 10% of your body size every 6 months. Now, that's not just weight bearing, that's across the board. And a lot of that isn't recoverable. When your body atrophies, when your muscles atrophy, you don't get those cells back. That's what atrophy is. It's permanent cell loss. And so when you lose 10% of your body mass, you're losing some of your brain cells too in there. So when Captain Nowak was up in space, it turned out that she did end up with 3 severe mental disorders. When she did what she did, she was actually mentally ill. And yet, when she went to court, she didn't use her mental illnesses in her defense at all. And that is very typical of people with mental illnesses because they don't know they're mentally ill. She didn't see anything wrong with her behavior. When she did go to court, she accepted a deal where she got demoted and then she had to resign from the military. That was her only punishment. And so effectively really didn't have her day in court because she went to court mentally ill. And when you're mentally ill and you're in court, it has to be addressed in the court, and you have to have the right help alongside of you, and she didn't have that. Yes?
Well, would you say from another perspective that since her brain was giving her the signals that she wasn't responding well to her environment, she took this bizarre behavior, which ultimately got her out of the military.
It did, that's right. Away from being in the dangerous.
So that her brain would be, imperiled.
Exactly.
Anti-gravity.
Exactly. That's a way of interpreting it, is that she did the things that was necessary to get her out of danger. There are a lot of images now that show people with either schizophrenia or bipolar disorder have a much smaller brain by the end of life. And the biggest part of the brain that's damaged are the frontal lobes. And of course, that's where we think we make most of our decisions and impulse control and that kind of thing. And if Captain Nowak had, her frontal lobes damaged, that would have caused her to help her do the bizarre things that she did, effectively removing her from that harmful environment that she was in. She really didn't, the press really hammered her wrongly. And I did, after I published my paper, I wrote a letter to NASA headquarters and said, please look at the results of my paper where I show the brain damage that's done both internally and externally when astronauts go up in space and are mentally ill, and that Captain Nowak may have been the proverbial canary in the coal mine that says that you need to make the space astronauts work under 1G rather than 0G. That 0G may be too dangerous for the astronauts, and start thinking about designing things in space to create artificial gravity. Mental illness, environment versus biology. I contend that people, quite often there's mental illness in families, parents and there's children and maybe grandchildren. But from my own experience, I can say that parents that have either emotional issues or mental issues while they're raising their children quite affect how their children are raised. And quite often, if one or both, or if both of your parents are, have you guys ever heard of the term codependent, which is an alcoholic paradigm? If you have alcoholic parents, the survival mechanism that children of alcoholics develop is codependent behavior, and which affects their relationships in their grown-up adult life. And so my point is that if children become mentally ill, you need to look at the environment that they're in, not their DNA, is my belief. If you do have mental issues, to get help, to make sure that they don't land on your child and cause them some kind of strangeness too as well. Yes?
Well, what they've really been finding is that the ACE study found that there was a connection between trauma and mental health. Yeah. And then looking into that more and more, what they found is that the more trauma you have, the shorter your telomeres are. Yes. Which is, with gene expression. Then it shortens your life. And it shortens your life. And with epigenetics, there was a really good article just the other day about how much of that they're finding is inheritable, and that the gene expression methylation is inheritable, but they actually reversed it in mice. In mice, they've been able to reverse it. Actually, direct injection to the brain of a certain chemical. Now so they were looking at potential applications of that in humans. Yes. And would you take that shot that would remove the effects of trauma.
Right, on your lifespan.
And it would change who you were.
It would, yeah, it would. Now, what I think would be genetic based is the sensitivity of our DNA to trauma. You know, some people may lose 10%,
exactly.
Or other people may only lose 5%, but that sensitivity would be genetic based.
Probably have an interplay with that too, with the restoration.
Yeah, yeah. And so my point is that when parents have mentally ill children, it's really convenient to say, oh, gee, it's DNA. I did the best I could, you know. And you know, when I look at, I was raised by my mother was mentally ill, and I talked to my mom, and she said, well, I did the best that I could, and I let it fall. That doesn't mean it was good enough, you know. Doing the best you can really doesn't mean it was good enough. And so, but I didn't say that to her. I let her, you know, go without ever saying that to her, but in my own mind. Yes.
What is why was she not good enough?
Well, what the best that she did?
But what happened?
No food. Let's see. We lived in ice and snow.
You got schizophrenia or bipolar?
4 boys.
Oh, you all did?
All 4 boys.
Not you though?
Me too.
You too?
Yeah.
You're schizophrenic?
Pardon?
You're schizophrenic?
No, bipolar,
okay.
with features of psychotic and paranoia, from age 7. Yeah. And all 3 of my brothers were either schizophrenic or bipolar.
And she was mentally ill too?
She was mentally ill, yes. My mother, yeah. Yeah, yes.
Are you familiar with Dr. Bruce Lipton and the biology of perception?
No.
It's very interesting, where he is a biologist and he does a lot of research with the ability to change your gene mapping based on how your body responds perceptively to its environment.
Well, we know that the brain is plastic. We call it plasticization, but it adapts to, it's continually changing, and as well as our body too. And so with the power that the subconscious has over our body, it can do amazing things. And so that's my spiel about, you know, is it genetic or is it environmental? I believe it's completely environmental. Yes.
Well, they say that the person is a problem and they're acting out, and it's just this show.
Yeah. They can act out, sure. A lot of
times they say the kid is just difficult, and
you got to look at the parenting that's going on at the same time. Yeah. And so you got to look at the parenting one. You know, at school they were at a teacher like 8 hours, but when they go home, that's where they learn the person they're going to be at is from home. Pardon? Yes, whether or not there's nurturing going on. Yeah. But I had to cover this because if mental illness was genetic, we would have to go in a different direction. We'd go then to the DNA, and we wouldn't be able to use PHM to be able to predict mental illness. So that's why we had to look at this. Is it genetic based? No, genetic based is in a predictive medicine program. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that is pretty definitive that it is epigenetic, that it's, you know, that it's in the middle, that the DNA, actually the DNA gene expression is in response to the environment. So it is the environment control.
It is
yes. So it is environmentally based.
Well, it comes out biologically.
Right, so it comes out biologically.
So when astronauts are up in deep space, how are we going to find out their mental health? And so this is meant to be a board where in the electronics equipment where we pick off data from how the board is doing. Well, we want to do exactly the same thing with the human brain, except we can't put wires into the astronaut's head to get the data out. So what we proposed to do was to look at the behavior due to the circadian and ultradian rhythms. The circadian rhythms are the 24-hour rhythms of our body, and then the ultradian rhythms are like 90 to 120 minutes. So that requires collecting a lot of data related to those rhythms on each astronaut in order to be able to use this PHM technology. And so we don't have to stick wires into the brain. We can just record the data that they're doing. And we came up with a whole bunch of measurements. Let's see, I just talk about again the durations that the different rhythms are, 12 and 24 hour, and then 90 to 120 minutes. Oh, here's some pictures showing brain damage. to both the most of the brain for those with severe mental illnesses of either bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, where the brain has decided to change the chemistry, but also an overexposure to cortisol and adrenaline, which really causes the brain to shrink. The kind of, these are the algorithms that we use in our company that are proprietary. They're very hard to read. But these algorithms are used under all worst case conditions where you've got too much data, not enough data, and you've got noise or where the data is corrupted, it's unreliable. Each one of these is a series of events where you nullify the problems that you've got in the data, because remember, the data for the astronauts are coming from space, and there's a lot of opportunity for the data to be corrupted or spoiled or disappear, or don't have the time to look at all of it because you get a whole bunch. And so all of these rules that we came up with, these are proprietary algorithms, are meant to handle every possible problem that can occur for astronauts in space. And then this shows the diagnostic data that we would need from the astronaut circadian and ultradian rhythms. This is just showing what the ultradian rhythm looks like, you know, the 90-minute or 20-minute cycles, and how they define what a wavelength is. Here's a list of 40 or so measurements that we came up with that needed to be collected on each astronaut in order to determine, do they have a likelihood of becoming mentally ill while they're still on the ground before they get launched to space, develop a baseline of behavior for each astronaut. And from that, you can tell whether or not they've had some trauma in their life that has already started them down the path of excessive cortisol and excessive adrenaline. And so to look at that, and then once they get into space, then you start comparing the same data with the baseline, and you can look at the deviations in those measurements that are taken. And so it's about 40 or so measurements, and there's like things like how much exercise are they doing on their own? How much, when they're given an assignment to exercise, say 90 minutes, are they doing 90 minutes? How much are they doing? 88 or 92? Are they doing too much, or are they doing too less? To record that kind of data, those are the subtle changes that will occur as a result of the erosion, the atrophy, the shrinking of the brain in the center of the brain too, where the thalamus and the hypothalamus and the fight or flight response comes from. That's where those data comes from. So it gives you an indication of what's going on at the core of the brain by looking at these kinds of measurements. That includes, urination, how much fluid intake are they taking in, what should they be taking in, what are they actually taking in, and that's true for solids, for liquids, how much are they getting rid of, how much on their own, how much relaxation time do they want, how much relaxation time are they forced to take. Everything about them is recorded, and from that data over a period of weeks, months, and years, if they happen to be in space, you can see the deviation. That was a short-term 24-hour plot for normal short-term body temperature data, short-term over a 24-hour period of the systolic blood pressure, and then for the heart rate. And so this is this is how we would plot up the data. Only 24 hours a day, weeks, months, and years. Look at this and track it. First you get at what normal is, and then you look for deviations from normal. Here was some of our expected results to illustrate how PHM would identify premature aging of the brain and then be able to predict mental illness from this data. Okay, so here's some more, I don't know if anybody can see, this is some more data that's plotted out for the ultradian during moderate light and bright light. But again, these are measurements of cortisol, I think, and different things that are related to the circadian ultradian rhythms, both short-term and long-term. And then these are plots of melatonin release of the body over a 24-hour period. This is the person, this is what it would look like for a normal, healthy, mentally healthy person. This is what we would expect over a 24-hour period for a person who's mentally ill in space of the melatonin over a 24-hour period. So this is using data from the circadian rhythms for melatonin response. So that's how distorted, you know, the release of that chemical gets when they're suffering from too much cortisol and too much adrenaline. And so how do you recover from mental illness? And what is a balanced versus an unbalanced life? And what we have here in this chart shows things about, you know, work and yourself and spirituality and family and children and friends and playing, making sure that in a person's life, notice that they're all equal in size. You know, you don't see work, you know, having the majority of that chart. And what this is intended to show is that you work toward a balanced life is trying to have equal time for all of those things. Don't spend 5 minutes on your friendships when you're working 60 hours a week. To offset the 60 hours of work week, if you have to do that, you increase the time you're spent with your friends, with your family, in spirituality. You don't cut back. And as most people do. Most people say, well, I'm working 60 hours a week. I don't have the energy and the time. And so what happens is, you know, 6 months later, they're crazy because they've worked themselves to death. They haven't balanced. They haven't added. If they do something negative, they're not doing something positive to balance it out. And that's what working to a balanced life means. And so this is a chart trying to show what a lot of people's lives look like. Here's life, and then there's friends over here, and all kinds of stuff, you know, that can take up your time and fills up your day. This is what we call an unbalanced life, okay? And that's what most of us learn to live until we end up with some kind of a, you know, a depression or some kind of a mental disorder. How do we, what do we do? Obviously that requires, you know, major changes in our decisions, and which is awfully hard for a lot of people to do because change is hard on anybody. And the size of change that I'm talking about is major in your life in order to acquire a balanced lifestyle. And it's not something you can do overnight, but it's something to work on weeks, months, and years in your life in order to offset, you know, the negative. And that's what we have to do to astronauts out in space if they acquire some form a mental illness. We've got to change what it is that they're doing and bring in more work, more friendship, more family, more spirituality.
There's not much opportunity in space to unwind.
Right, they can't unwind. You can't unwind. And so you have to offset that with more communications with your family.
Earth and take a vacation.
You can't do that, right. But you can get off the dangerous assignments of going outside and having to do repairs. You know, if you've got a problem, you know, you don't get they don't assign you to those kind of things, and you start increasing for a person like that's on in a spaceship and he's developing a mental illness. Then you make sure that he's not put on any more dangerous assignments. That he's increases time on the good stuff, more in spirituality, more spending time communicating with his family, with his children. That's all NASA. That's all available. It's all there. Yeah. And so, what if you see the people up in the space station now? You know, they have a cell phone and they can call their family almost any time they want. Pardon? Space? Yeah, from space. Yeah, yeah, they can call directly. And so, the same thing will happen on deep space. Is you have to change the environment. You have to bring them back into a more balanced lifestyle. And balance means, you know, cut the hours of work, increase the time with family and friends and loved ones, and relaxation, as well as, you know, doing things creatively. How to recover from the brain damage caused from mental illness. These are some charts that don't show up very well, but these are the type of pictures that are available in the publication showing that meditation, if you're in a serious meditation program, you can increase. These are scientific measurements. These are the outputs of published papers from scientific studies where they were able to physically measure and take these images, proving that meditation over a long period of time does increase the actual size of the brain, which helps you recover from the effects of cortisol and adrenaline. So it's a way of trying to regain your mental brain size anyway. And down here at the bottom is the actual paper that this is from. Brain changes in long-term Zen meditation using using the magnetic MRIs to show it in a controlled study. And I've got the authors there too. That's just one of many that's available. And so I think I've already covered this, making lifestyle changes. As we said earlier, quite our society and our culture today, it makes it very difficult. But for folks up in space that are in a very controlled, much like people in a submarine, with the knowledge that we're passing on, to the Canadian Space Agency and the aerospace industry, recognizing that they have to make changes in the people's lives once they put them up into space in that harsh environment. That's all we're doing, is just trying to educate them and say, this is the kind of thing that you need to do in the event that something wrong happens. It's not that some people have willpower and some don't. It's that some people are ready to change and others are not. And that's in terms of making lifestyle changes to get you into a more balanced life. This was the results of our work. This was the original definitions that we had for these 5 disorders, where we said they were pretty much a brain disorder, and then identifying what symptoms to expect. It's nothing more than what I've been talking to you and saying about how these are messages from the subconscious to the conscious. So we got to redefine what those were, and what we said was, in terms of changes to the brain, that it was self-induced damage done, and that it's not reversible. It's currently not reversible. You have to take drugs for bipolar disorder quite often, and schizophrenia. But if you begin making lifestyle changes, it'll enhance the effects of the medication. It will improve it. What happens now quite often is people are continually changing drugs and medication, and they're blaming the medication for not working anymore. And quite often it's due to the changes that they have going on in their life that causes that drug to not work and they need to switch medications. So if they're working on a path so that they're in a more balanced lifestyle, they'll hopefully reduce the amount of medications that they need to change, and this is true for the astronauts, and enhance the effects of whatever medication that they are on, make it work better, is our belief. Pardon?
Some of the medications aren't right for some.
Right, for some, not all people, and so they do need to get changed, yeah. But sometimes people will be on something for like 10 years, and it will stop working. And they'll say, oh, it just stopped working. And they never bother to look and find out, oh my God, I married this woman, I got married, and we're battling all the time, and we're in a hostile relationship, and guess what? My medication doesn't work anymore. They don't connect what's going on in their personal life. Huh? On both, And instead of just blaming the medication, look at what's going on in your life and try to connect the dots that way too. I should say men. I was a very sexist example, wasn't it? Work on the relationship to get rid of that, right. I agree. So, and that's, these are just kind of examples of what I just went over, where, quite often in discussions, they complain about the drugs and having to change them all the time, that we suggested to the Canadian Space Agency that they put it in different terms. They put it in terms of what's going on in their life rather than what's happening with the drugs, is what we told the Canadian, and that would make a better likelihood of success. In summary, mental illness has been reported by NASA on their manned space missions, and with them going deeper into space and longer missions, there's likely to be more severe mental illnesses occurring. This is nothing more than what I've been saying all along. Subconscious uses the symptoms of mental illness to communicate with the conscious, using PHM and the data from the astronaut Circadian and Ultradian rhythms can be used to predict and prevent mental illness in deep space. One of the things I wanted to say was that, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that if you can come up with drugs to suppress the fight or flight response, much as we suppress the immune system, it will probably take care of the majority of illnesses and diseases that we acquire in our life, because the fight or flight response has such major control over our bodies and our life. And so we already have the drugs that suppress our immune system. I believe that by suppressing the fight or flight response, we can get rid of the drugs that we use to suppress our immune system, and you really kill 2 birds with one drug.